All right.
Good
Well, greetings,
afternoon,
everyone.
everybody, and welcome to this virtual professional development opportunity. My name is Joe Schmidt, and I'm the Social Studies Specialist for the Maine Department of Education. Today, we are welcoming back Dr. Dean Vesperman from the University of Wisconsin River Falls. He had presented this past May around some aspects of culturally responsive and brain studies work, and it was very well received. And he was one of the people, one of the presenters that I had some of my participants say, hey, can we get Dr. Vesperman back to learn more? So I reached out, and he has graciously agreed to give us another hour of his time. Today, we're talking about chewing and chunking. How do we teach using culturally responsive pedagogy in the brain? So without any further ado, Dr. Dean Vesperman from the University of Wisconsin River Falls.
And thank you, everyone, for attending today. At any time you have a question, you can turn on your microphone and ask, because that's a great time. Because sometimes, look, our short-term memory doesn't work in a way that we remember questions we have at slide number 2, and then at the end, then you're trying to remember the question you had at that moment. So how do we teach? So a quick introduction. I taught social studies for 11 years in southeastern Wisconsin. My master's was on brain-based learning from Cardinal Stritch. While I was working on my doctorate at Indiana University, my minor is in the learning sciences. So working on how do children construct knowledge and how does this occur in the activity of the classroom? And then, of course, then that influences my research. You know, how do students construct, how do teachers construct knowledge? At University of Wisconsin River Falls, I teach social studies methods, educational psychology. This last semester, I've taught multicultural education. So a plethora of classes, but social studies is my home base. That's where I belong. So culturally responsive teaching. For some of you who were at the PD in May, this is going to be a little bit of a refresh, a review. For those of you who weren't there, this is the basis of this work that we're doing today. And the primary focus then of a lot of the things that I'm presenting to you today come from the work of Gloria Ladson-Billings, Dr. Lisa Delpit, and Dr. Zaretta Hammond. And Gloria Ladson-Billings, she is the person who came up with the concept of culturally responsive teaching. She's the first architect of it. Delpit and Zaretta Hammond have taken that work and expanded it in several ways. What the key aspect of culturally responsive teaching is about empowering students to retain their cultural identity and to succeed academically. Culture is not a deficit. Race is not a deficit. Gender is not a deficit. And one of the things that culturally responsive teaching and pedagogy pushes us to do is to stop thinking about those as deficits or barriers or something to hinder our classroom, but how do we bring these things into our classroom as assets and assets for learning? Next, especially Dr. Hammond's work, she argues that culture plays a key role in learning and knowledge construction. Children don't leave their culture at the classroom, at the schoolroom door. And so how do we make sure that we're teaching in a way in which children's brains and minds actually function and work? Because culture is a key lens. And we know that children use culture, which is driven by language, to explain the external world. We'll talk more about that. And then that's one of the other issues, and we'll talk about a bit today, is the issue of code switching. We're not going to cover it too much today, but helping children both construct knowledge in the vernacular and using disciplinary language. And being able to switch between the two is really important for knowledge construction. And as I said, one of my favorite lines, and this is from Lisa Delpit, is that children cannot leave their culture at the schoolhouse door. And so that's one of those key aspects of culturally responsive teaching. And again, I know this is a bit of a review, but one of the key aspects about this then is, all right, so how do we make sure that this is being brought into our classrooms? How do we make sure that there's a space for it? How do we make sure that we use these assets? The other thing I want to quickly review then is the information processing model. And this is the memory system model from Zaretta Hammond uses this, and Patricia Wolf. Wolf has this great book, if you can find it, it's called Brain Matters. It does a great job of looking at neuroscience, new breakthroughs in neuroscience, and what does this mean for how we teach in the classroom in the human brain. And both Wolf and Hammond use this model for describing learning. And if you want, at some point, I'm going to go through these quickly. I'm not going to spend as much time as I did in May talking about these, the layers of the memory system. Today, we're going to focus a lot on working memory. We're going to focus a lot on working memory. I want to press, set that up first. Couple key things: sensory data. We decode the external world around us. Sensory data, we have our 5 senses. One of the key things about sensory data is that, when it comes to sensory data and complex learning, we really only use 3 senses for complex learning because they're tied to language. And that's auditory, visual, and our kinesthetic senses, touch, those types of things. One of the key things that the research that Wolf and Hammond have done, and it's very important, is that it's really important to know we do not construct language using only 1 sense. We use all 3. And so one of the key things that both Wolf and Hammond challenge is the idea of learning styles that you have visual learners or kinesthetic learners or auditory learners. And they argue is that that's just not how we construct language. We construct language with all 3. We have to be focusing on all 3. That's very important. Short-term memory, again, it's very short. We don't store much in our short-term memory, but short-term memory is where we engage students when we ignite learning. This is where we get them to connect to what they've done in the past, connect to something they're learning now. The emotional responses then that occur from that aha moments when you introduce something challenging or something new. But short-term memory is what it is. It's very short. And again, a reminder for short-term memory, our short-term memory does not work to remember everything. A lot of our sensory data is dumped. So 95% of our sensory data gets dumped by the brain. We don't process it because it's not important, it's not necessary, we don't have to pay attention to it. And that's one of the reasons why, and this has worked, we're all veteran teachers. How many of you have had a student who raises their hand, asks to go to the bathroom, but you're in the middle of something important, you ask them and you say, well, this is really important now, can you wait 5 minutes? And 5 minutes later, right, they're not asking to go to the bathroom again. And the reason why is because since you said it was important and you're teaching and they're now paying attention to you, their RAS in their inner brain is ignoring their bladder. Their bladder is still saying they got to go or they want to go, but now the cerebrum is saying, okay, we're going to ignore that. This is more important, right? So short-term memory is really built for that aha moments, deciding what's really important, what we're going to hold on to, what we're going to forget. And it's really built to forget, not to remember. Working memory is essential, and we're going to spend a lot of time today on this because this is where children construct knowledge. Knowledge construction occurs in working memory, and this is where chunking and chewing what we're learning is so essential for memory construction and for knowledge construction. Long-term memory, a lot of times we as teachers tend to focus, bless you, on our long-term memory. But here's the one thing about long-term memory. Long-term memory is really just a library. It's a storage area. This is where we can keep things that we want to keep for longer periods of time. Long-term memory, another time we could talk about it more. There's always things about when long-term memory and knowledge construction, we always have to be careful of, is when we construct knowledge in our working memory, it's tied to context. If what we're constructing is over-contextualized, so like if we say the old classic sentence, well, you need this for the test, right, JP? We go, hey, you need this for the test. Well, then what happens is children construct the knowledge, they tie it to the test, and then what happens 2 weeks after the test? It's gone, right? Because the context of storing it was tied to this and not something else. So long-term memory we can talk about a bit, but today, like I said, I'm going to focus a lot more on working memory. And then both Wolf and Hammond say that the cognitive development, what we're doing in our classrooms is we're trying to get our children to expand their capacity and speed of thinking. And part of that we're going to talk about is related to automation. how do we get them to automate some learning? Because that's part of what we do. And we'll talk more about this. And then the other reminder from both of them is that schema construction, when they're working on building knowledge, new knowledge is constructed on existing knowledge. And that's so essential for us to remember, is that if we want students to be constructing something in working memory, it has to be tied to something they already know, whether it's about their personal lives, whether about it's part of their school lives, whether it's part of their disciplinary lives, but it has to have that foundation for us to do that. And here's a good point. I like to stop and say, are there questions? I know I'm racing through this a bit, and part of it is, you know, I don't want to teach grandmothers how to knit. So if you were here in May, I don't want to reteach something that I've already talked about. Are there any questions? You can unmute and ask. Okay, good. All right, well, we'll move on then. So let's talk about working memory, because this is the workhorse of our memory system. All right, so the first part of working memory that's important for us to think about when we get to children to chunk and chew is that there's a limited number of things they can have going on in working memory, right? Working memory is not an infinite space. You can't have a whole bunch of tasks going on at once. The research says your average student can only have about 5 to 9 cognitive tasks. And a cognitive task is, the definition is right there, and this is from Wolf. It's anything that requires effort to perform. So I want you to think about, for a second, all of us are teachers. We all have our students write essays. I want you to think about how many different tasks does it require or take to write an essay. Now's a good time. I want you to unmute, jump in, throw out tasks. So what are the tasks you need them to do to write an essay?
Research the topic.
Research the topic. Okay, good. Another one. Go ahead, Faith.
I was just going to say, organize the information.
Organize information. Good. So we got 2 cognitive tasks going. Next.
Process the information.
Process. Yep. 3.
Know how to cite sources.
Cite sources. 4.
Basic grammar, spelling, punctuation.
Right. Yep. And those are all, each of them are different cognitive tasks. So syntax, semantics, punctuation, right, is all part of that, right? Their handwriting, so that's graphemic awareness. They're writing words, phonemic awareness, right? So we can start going down this list, right? Basic structure of a paragraph, basic structure of a sentence. When you start to unpack what it takes to write an essay, you begin to find that, you know, your student, if they haven't automated some of these tasks, are chewing up a lot of their memory in some of these. So a good example is when we have English language learners, EL students, I mean, just think about how much of their working memory is going to be used up just in graphemic or phonemic awareness. You know, how to write letters and the sounds that letters make in words, right? So one of the key things then about that then is we begin to think about, you know, think about some of the students who you've had in the past who struggled with writing essays. And if we begin to unpack all the tasks that are required in doing that, we might find that what happened was they hit their cognitive load, right? They, in their working memory, they hit the number of tasks they could have going. And this is the thing we know about in our research, and research in working memory is when a child hits their cognitive load, what happens is they start losing access to long-term memory. They lose access to particular things they've learned. Or what happens is particular tasks become melded into other tasks. So then they start, so you see these things happening. And then the other thing we know with cognitive load, when a student hits cognitive load, it can push them from productive struggle into unproductive struggle. And that's one of the key, that's a really important thing for us to think about when we have our students chunking and chewing. So, you know, when do students, when we see them begin to struggle, right? Is it the productive struggle we want, which causes growth? Or are they pushed into unproductive struggle where they're no longer learning, right? And that's one of the things that we see then is it's really tied to and can be tied to the issue of students' cognitive load. One of the things we do know from the research then is one of the things that helps with cognitive load is automation of tasks, right? If we can ease a student's cognitive load during a class, during their, when they're taking a test, when they're writing an essay, we know them by doing that, they can access more things, they can do more complex work. And so one thing we can do is, like, a good example is graphic organizers. Using those for students to scaffold their learning helps them automate particular tasks. If you're having your students write an essay test, if you have a student who struggles with finishing an essay test, or a short answer question during a time period, giving them a little scaffold that reminds them a basic structure of a well-written paragraph that, on a card. A key thing about that is we give the scaffold, we help them grow, and then at some point, of course, we're going to take that scaffold away because we want them to construct that knowledge and to automate that task, right? But that's one of the key things. We want to ease their cognitive load so we can push them to doing higher level thinking and to do higher level tasks. And then once we do that, then of course we can continue to expand their capacity and speed for learning. The other thing about working memory is loopy. And when I learned this when I was working on my master's, it literally changed how I was teaching social studies. And we have two key loops, and they're over here in the little diagram. I want to talk about these loops in how we get working in memory. And I want you to take a look at that diagram. What stands out to you? I want you to put that in the chat. So I'm going to give you all a minute. Look at that diagram of working memory. And then don't write anything in the chat quite yet. I'm going to do a waterfall chat and I'll tell you. But what stands out to you? What are you seeing and learning? All right. Right, hit send. Yep, episodic buffer is central, and we're going to talk about that. Good. Other things that stand out to you? Yep. Yes. There's a flow between these functions. It's not, our working memory is not linear. Good points. Others? I know it's been a long day of teaching for all of us. So getting our brain going and thinking about this, yeah. I'm gonna wait. Let's get one or two more responses. Good. All right. So working memory is loopy. And I want to talk about the phonological loop first. Phonological loop is tied to language. And the language we use when we're constructing knowledge. And so notice, by the way, what the phonological loop does is it's pulling from long-term memory the words we already know into working memory. It's connecting to the central executive, which is telling the phonological loop to process the new words or process words we already know. And what it keeps doing then is moving back and forth. And this is one of the key things about language, that when I especially work with my pre-service teachers about, that they don't always think about, because when we were really young and we were learning language acquisition was not easy. It took us a long time to do this. And we forget about then how difficult it can be sometimes to learn new words, to learn new concepts, to have those things. So our phonological loop is running, and that's tied to language and words. The next loop that's going on is visual spatial. And I like this little diagram because it's called the sketch pad, visual spatial loop, visual spatial sketch pad. So at the same time we're working and functioning at a linguistic level, nouns and verbs, those things, we're also creating an image of what we're learning. We're actually constructing, right? And then now as adults with our prefrontal cortex, we can see things almost three-dimensionally as we're thinking about them. We can see the things in real life as they go. One of the interesting things about this is, if any of you have really young children or you had young children, remembering how they learned to think about them, to think about their world in 3 dimensions in abstract ways. And in Piaget wrote about that. And the idea that, like he wrote about the fact that for children to understand the world in abstract thought, they have to have a concrete foundation of what they're thinking about. And the same thing is for us as adults. We don't think about the concrete things anymore because we've done this so much. We don't have to have that concrete foundation anymore that children did. So one of the key things about the working memory then is working memory is both visual and spatial, and it's phonological. So we want to keep playing with that idea of how would we get children, when we chunk and chew, to make sure that we're working with these working memory loops. So how are we engaging them in language? How are we engaging them in time and space? How are we getting them to move? And as they learn, those types of things. And then lastly is the episodic buffer. And the episodic buffer is really important for learning, because the episodic buffer then constructs the memory of the learning process, the context of the learning. And your episodic buffer then also controls the context of how you access your long-term memory. So what are you pulling from your long-term memory that's now going to help you with your phonological and visual spatial loops, right? That buffer then is really important, because remember, this is one of the things that when we're teaching, if we have a student who gives us a wrong answer, part of the reason why that wrong answer might occur is because of what they're recalling from their long-term memory, right? So what are they pulling from their long-term memory? Well, if they're pulling an incomplete idea, or they're pulling a popular myth that they were taught, like, one of the favorite ones I always had when I was teaching geography was students would always tell me that rivers don't flow north except for the Nile. And so, that's something that got constructed into the long-term memory. And what I realized was this, as a teacher, we had to just unpack it. Okay, so where did this idea come from? How is this constructed? Where did this misconception, and how is this built? And then we see that then, the episodic buffer, context. The other thing that we know is if students learn in one context, if they're constructing knowledge in a context, when we come to assessment, we should be assessing in a similar context. Because if we change the context between the learning and the assessment, we might actually cause their episodic buffer to not work in their working memory. So one of the things I'll be honest, one of the practices I learned when I was working in my master's, when I learned about this, I was one of those teachers who believed you had to, new seating charts on the day of a test. So day of the test would come in, the students would come in, there'd be a new seating chart, because you want to cut down on cheating and copying and things like that. And what I didn't realize was I was changing the context of learning. So some of my students might have struggled on my tests when I was a young teacher because the context of how they constructed knowledge has now changed. And so after learning this, so when I started a new unit is when I would do new seats. So this is how working memory works. It's how it's loopy. This is how children construct knowledge in working memory. There's a limited number of tasks that they can do. We have to work on helping them automate tasks. We have to pay attention to the linguistic and the visual natures of learning, and then the context of learning. And so Hammond then and Wolf write about schema construction. And some of this could be review, some of this might be new. Well, a couple of things about this. First of all, one, we want to look for three things to occur when students are learning. And the first is assimilation. That students have a schema, we've activated it in the Ignite at the beginning of our lesson, the beginning of our unit, and students are literally just adding new information to this schema, right? And it seems almost seamless, right? Your students are just working and it doesn't seem like they're struggling with their learning. They're not having to work very hard to learn. This is just being added, right? The one problem with assimilation in schema construction is students might not be aware that they're actually learning. They might not be aware that their ideas are changing, the schema's changed, they're growing. Next is accommodation, and that's when new information doesn't fit. And what we know from the research is when this occurs, what happens is children basically either change existing schema, readjust it, remodify it, or they create new schema. And sometimes you'll see this and you'll have the students in your class. And let's say you're talking about the idea of the concept of the president, right? In the office of the president. And what you'll see is students will intentionally separate good presidents and bad presidents as if they're two separate concepts. So instead of having this overall conception, the schema of presidents, with some presidents being quote unquote good, some being bad, within that one concept, they'll actually create two individual schema, right? And part of it, when you might find is because there are presidents we talk about in very heroified ways, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and then there are presidents we talk about in heroic ways, William Harding, sometimes Andrew Jackson now today versus how Andrew Jackson was taught 20 years ago, things like that. And then we can also have transformation, and what we can see then is when we're teaching children something, whatever we're teaching them new actually leads to a significant or dramatic change in an existing schema or interrelated schema. And those are when those big aha moments come about. When you're teaching something and the child's eyes light up and they're just gone, right? They're bright. They're getting this type of, situation where suddenly they're getting it. And so this is important for chunking and chewing, because when we talk about introducing new material, we're going to be looking at chunking. And then when we talk about processing or causing equilibrium or disequilibrium, that comes with chewing, right? So how do we get them to chunk and chew as we teach? And we're going to get into that now. So let's take a look at working memory and how we teach. So how this new knowledge of working memory, how does this affect our teaching? So chunking, we're going to look at chunking first. And that's getting students to connect new information to existing information. And then what do we do as teachers to break this new information down to, and I like Hammond's idea of making it digestible, something that they can understand, make sense of, and use. And there's a couple of ways we do this. Organization. So when we start out right from the beginning with new information, we want to start out with some sort of organization that they could use. Word webs, timelines, T-charts, Venn diagrams, these types of tools we use really help with organization. The next is rehearsal. Sometimes in social studies, we don't do enough rehearsal. Before before we get to a summative assessment. We don't practice writing an essay enough. Sometimes we don't have them practice writing research papers enough. We don't get enough rehearsal. And then, of course, what it means then is our students don't have the schema for it, and then they struggle. Good rehearsal methods, entrance and exit tickets, other forms of bell ringers. Right? You can do in-class discussions. You could do electronic thread discussions. One of my favorite ones that I like using now is Twistery. And what that is doing is having students at certain points, either you can have them, you can create a little graphic organizer and you can find them online. They're really nice, where they have 142 characters to write their own tweet about what they just learned. Right? I've worked with some teachers who actually had them on Twitter. And then they have a hashtag for the class. And so they're tweeting and the teacher then is literally watching the tweets come in as they're teaching. So they're watching. Trust, when I teach that way, it takes me time because I have not automated how to balance my teaching with watching Twitter. So having to watch both consumes a lot of my working memory. But I've seen Twistery. I had some students who were working during their student teaching, were working with students who were, they had been basically labeled, they were behind. And they were working with these students. And so they used Twitter then to get these students, because these students weren't taking notes and they weren't filling out the graphic organizers. But my students got them to use Twitter and to start tweeting about what they were learning. And what happened was the students became more engaged. They listened more to what their teacher was doing, and their scores improved. They went from failing tests to getting low C's and D's. But what it did was it engaged their working memory in different ways, in a way that they were willing to work. So that was rehearsal. Elaboration. Here's where we have students taking what they already know and trying to get them, before we start teaching, to expand what it might mean, right? So we want to take what they already know and have them expand upon it before we teach a single new thing, right? So we get to, so we're doing a lot of prediction work. So what do you think is going to happen next? How do you think Congress will respond to this? How do you think the people might respond to that? Those types of opening questions. And then here we can use a bunch of different formats to get them to start doing that. Journaling works really well. Whether it's journaling in a composition book, or journaling in their social studies notebook, or journaling online. Electronic discussion threads are a great place for having students work on this also. So you could ask them some predictive questions at the end of something to predict what they might see in the next unit you're teaching or the next lesson. And Twistery works really good at this point too in getting students to elaborate. So like one of my other favorite things to do, and when I do Twitter history Twistery, is they take on a persona of a famous person or an average person, and they tweet about what they think they're seeing. Like, so if Twitter existed in the 1830s, what might you tweet about oh, your neighbors are going on the Oregon Trail. Well, what would you tweet? Things like that. You're having them elaborate and expand on their learning and their knowledge. And these are the types of things then that get our students to start chunking. What do we do, right? So how do we teach for chunking, and how are we intentional in it? And I'm going to stress, the reason why we do chunking is because we're priming that working memory. We're activating what's in long-term memory. We're getting the episodic buffer to start accessing it. It allows us then to tap into the phonological and into the visual spatial loops, and then prime them for what Hammond argues is the real learning we do in social studies and the real learning we do in the classes, which is chewing, getting students to chew what they've learned. And that's getting them to process and use new information. So we chunk to get to chew. And then here, this is the fun part, I guess, of social studies, right? Rehearsal, pre-made skits, role plays, simulations, 3-minute or 5-minute writes. These are all great pedagogies for rehearsal. One of my favorite pre-made skits I had my American government students do. You can find these, every decision that the Supreme Court made over time, they have the written dialogue of the deliberations that occurred behind closed doors. So one of the things I did was I took the deliberation that occurred on Brown v. Board of Education, the first deliberation of it, before Justice Stone dies. And they have this, and so what I did was I took out parts of the deliberation for each justice. And I had my students then read these parts as a skit first. And then after the end of that skit, then the discussion was, well, if this is the Supreme Court and this is what you're hearing in their deliberations, how is the court going to vote? And what they found is that the court was going to probably vote 6-3 against Brown. And the students are just like, they're like, well, then they're just like, okay, so what changed? Because they knew that Brown v. Board gets passed, that the court decides in favor of Brown. And then what we do then is we then then I did the same thing. I took the deliberation from the Warren court, right? And now they're seeing these justices changing their opinions. And that's what then led to the Brown v. Board, the decision that, okay, and then they can begin to understand the influence of one justice on the court. And I could have just lectured it. They might have understood it. But this sort of rehearsal then allowed them through a pre-made skit, to actually then begin to explore these justices and their decision makings. Role plays, again, writing. The nice things about 3 and 5 minute writes, they don't have to be structured. So if you have a student like an EL student where writing a whole paragraph might struggle, have them write for 3 or 5 minutes a few bullets instead of trying to write the whole paragraph or whole ideas. Those types of things. The next thing is elaborations, right? So how do we get students to elaborate on what they're doing? Here we have another great set of pedagogies. Deliberations, structured academic controversies, legislative hearings, document-based questions, DBQs, are a great form of elaboration that we use in our classrooms. One thing I stress with teachers I work with, DBQs should be used with all students, not just our AP students. The other thing about it, I work with some teachers on, is getting them to think that paintings, songs, movie scenes, DBQs do not always have to be the typical written primary document. And then the third real thing to get them chewing then is manipulation, is getting them to manipulate new information. Scenarios are great for manipulation. One of my favorite ones I always used when I was a teacher and I use now is putting up scenarios related to the lemon test, especially with teachers. Here's a scenario. Does this pass or not pass the lemon test? Student written skits are great. Having them write their own skits about an event in history, something that's going on, current events, those types of things. Student directed role plays are great. Again, some of these ones for manipulation do take up more time in your classroom, but we are pushing our students towards higher level thinking, higher level knowledge construction. And it works really well. I mean, think about manipulation then and what happens then in the working memory when you have them, doing these higher level thinking, really requires them to rely a lot on the language that they've learned, the phonological loop. You're having them physically act things out, so they've got that visual spatial loop going on. We can really get them really doing some really active social studies when we get them chewing on it. All right. So what does this mean for us as social studies teachers? One of the first hopefully you learned today is that wrong answers are constructed. The great thing about wrong answers is we can always use wrong answers to lead us to right answers, especially if we do a deep dive on why a student thinks this way, why a student is given this answer, etc. Real social studies requires fluid intelligences. We want them problem solving. We don't want them, memorization is important because you need to memorize things for fluid intelligence, but we need them to, memorizing these things to be used for higher purposes, for more important things, problem solving, decision making, exploring the past, like historians, those types of actions. And the key thing, of course, is we know that research shows that we can't, unless we have children working through challenges and problem solving, their fluid intelligence doesn't expand. They don't construct it. And like I said, students, you do need to memorize. There's always that popular myth that students don't need to memorize. No, students do need to memorize. That's important, but we needed to do it for a higher purpose. I mean, let's be honest. If you're going to be a citizen today in the United States, do you need to know where all 50 states are? Well, if you're a good citizen, you should. Right? But we need a higher purpose for it. And of course, NCSS, I'm going to tie it back to citizenship. Right? And then lastly, the culture of the child in the community is an asset. So our children come into our classrooms, whether it's rural Maine, whether it's Washington, D.C., whether it's, Wisconsin, urban, the Twin Cities, urban area. All of our children have culture and they bring it in, and their community is an asset in our classroom, because if we know it, that's a foundation that we can build other learning on. And then explains how children construct knowledge. Their culture influences how they decode the external world. And their culture then becomes part of that episodic buffer. So if we try and disconnect children from their culture, we get in the way of their working memory. So we have to make sure that, we have a good idea. I mean, we'll never be a full participant in somebody else's culture, but we can know their culture well enough to make sure that we're not shutting it off in the learning process. I want to give special thanks to Joe Schmidt for inviting me to come back and do professional development again. Of course, Loretta Hammond. If you're more interested in her work, Ready for Rigor is a great website. She has a ton of resources. You can YouTube. She has a bunch of TED Talks, which are really great to watch. She focuses more on learning in general. There's more, in that sense. So when you watch her work, of course, it's not focused on social studies, which is where I'm working on. And of course, then Patricia Wolf, her work on brain matters. You can find her book through ASCD. She has several other books that she's worked on. You can find articles from her. It's really good work about how she's really working on taking new neuroscience and making sure this is the practices we should be doing in our classroom, which we've been talking about today. And so now we have time for questions. And I only talked 3 minutes longer than I wanted.
Well, don't let that be deceiving to you, because you started 5 minutes later than scheduled. So you're probably—
Oh, that's true. Okay. So I was in time. Yes.
You're right in time.
I was right in time.
Do you have any questions for Dean, for yourself, for the good of the field?
Please.
I have a question. This is
Sure.
Campbell. Sure. When we talk about memorization,
Yes.
we kind of throw that term around.
Mm-hmm.
And it occurs to me that there's actually an implicit taxonomy when it comes to memorization.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you have if you could guide me to perhaps a reference work, or if you've known if anyone has, done an exploration besides my anecdotal kind of reasoning right now, right?
Yes. So yes. And the answer is, one of the things about it is, Patricia Wolf really addresses memorization in her work. Mm-hmm. And one of the things she says is if we really want students to memorize, there's two things we have to do. One, has to be for a higher purpose.
Yeah. Yes.
Right. Two, we have to chunk it. Right. We have to break it into manageable parts to make sure it functions within short-term memory. So one of the things I learned as a social studies teacher, when I first started teaching junior high, I had students doing the 50 state test. Oh, here's all 50 states label. And of course, anywhere from about a quarter to a third would fail the first time they took it. And what I realized was, over time, before I started my master's, was, okay, I'm going to have to teach them how to learn the 50 states before they're going to pass the test. I can't just give them the test and go. And then what I learned when I was working in my master's was I had to do even more, which is we literally had to go region by region of the United States and learn states in small chunks. And Faith, I'll be honest with you, one of the funnest things I ever did with my students was this. So you put your finger on Maine. So we put your finger on Maine. No, really, literally put your finger up on Maine, top right-hand corner up here, right? And it goes Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, New Hampshire. And just doing those little tricks like that. And it worked, because what happened then was my students, when I wanted them to learn the geography of Africa, my students out of the blue tell me, well, Mr. Vesperman, look, it goes, right? You literally start it, so they were like at Senegal and they go Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Senegal. And they started taking this little trick of doing that and thinking about things in abstract and then doing those things to really chunk it. So we have to have that higher purpose, and then we have to chunk it, right? And then we have to rehearse it and make the rehearsal enjoyable. And that's what Wolf argues in Brain Matters and those things.
And then you would go toward the analytic and predictive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And once we automate, and once that base knowledge gets memorized and automated, then what happens then is, of course, then, like a good example, just knowing the states, then you can begin to build bigger concepts like regions. Midwest is a region, right? Like, what is the Northeast? What is New England versus the Northeast? What is the Midwest versus the Great Plains? This allows you then to really start to expand those conceptions. But you really can't do that if they don't have that base knowledge automated in some way.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Other questions? Go ahead, Brett.
More of a comment, I guess. I really like the idea of using DBQs outside of AP classes. Clearly I use the FRQ questions to prep the kids in the US Gov and politics class, but it was just last year that I started using it in both of my history classes. There's so many great ways to pull things out. If you're using the Fordham website, for example, pulling out some sections and putting them together and maybe going to the archives. And you're right, not just using text, but also using pictures, audio files, pictures of something. I think it's a really great way to help them go through that elaboration process.
And now with how much more access we have to, various sources, either through the National Archives or the Library of Congress now, there's so much more we can, and then we have other great websites like, the Stanford History Project, great resources there for working with those types of things. So now the challenge is, and how do we do this? And then the question comes down to is then remember with working memory, with our students who need more work, then how do we, the first time we're doing a DBQ with our students, especially ones who have learning needs or their EL students, how are we scaffolding it, right? Because we want them challenged, but how do we give them the tools they can to make sure that they're that they aren't going to hit their cognitive load in working memory and then just suddenly stop learning? So how do we scaffold that learning? Other questions?
Any last questions for Dr. Vesperman? Well, Dean, thank you so much for giving us another hour of your time. I know how much you love talking about this topic, and you may have been almost as excited as the participants were in May to get to come back. They were very excited. I know you had brought up that as well. So thank you again for your time, and thank you for everyone for attending.